Bienvenido al podcast de Oratoria y Pronunciación en Inglés Americano. En este caso te traigo a una invitada que repito, es la segunda vez que Kayla Belush viene al podcast. Puedes encontrarla en un episodio en dos partes que tienes en el episodio 25 y 26, y en ese caso nuestra conversación iba sobre el tema de inglés para emprender. Es decir, si eres un emprendedor que tienes un negocio y quieres ampliar tus servicios, también quieres buscar clientes y abrirte al mercado internacionalmente. En este caso, nuestra conversación se centraba mucho más en lo que eran las habilidades de comunicación efectiva. El podcast de hoy vamos a hablarte sobre todo de pronunciación. Para mí el área de pronunciación es una parte fundamental para mejorar en esta habilidad y sobre todo para que ganes confianza, porque muchas veces nosotros como hispanohablantes nos sentimos como mucha vergüenza cuando escuchamos nuestra voz en inglés. Sentimos que somos un poco ridículos al hacerlo. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos desarrollar ese mindset para que realmente sientas confianza a la hora de pronunciar? Porque no solo la cosa va a nivel de lengua, lo que quiero es que veas con todo esto hay una gran parte de psicología. Esa es la mentalidad que tenemos que desbloquear. Y por otro lado está la parte de fonética, la parte de entender los sonidos del inglés, la parte de cómo nos entrenamos en los sonidos del inglés, más siendo hispanohablantes. Así que estas dos áreas te van a ayudar muchísimo a desbloquear. Por fin vas a entender a los nativos y que ellos te entiendan. Es algo que de hecho yo en mi viaje a Crear mi voz americana nunca había visto. En la formación más tradicional no se habla mucho de pronunciación. Entonces espero que el episodio de hoy te introduzca un poco en qué es esto de la pronunciación, en cómo puedes empezar a mejorar. Además te hablamos de algunos de los retos, de los sonidos más difíciles para nosotros y de un poco ese viaje a la inversa, porque lo curioso en este caso, a mí me gusta mucho con Kayla, es que ella creó su voz en español, mientras que yo he creado mi voz en inglés americano. Entonces, como un viaje a la inversa. Lo más curioso de todo, y a medida que sigas más este canal, yo creo mucho en la manifestación con neurociencia, es decir, en el hecho del poder de nuestro subconsciente para crear nuestra realidad. Y de hecho, al crear una nueva voz, estás manifestando y expandiendo no solo tu vida, sino todas tus relaciones. El hecho de que yo utilizara como punto de referencia Nueva York, la ciudad de Nueva York, la cultura americana, y que esté manifestando o atrayendo a todos estos invitados, que curiosamente son todos de Nueva York, a mí me resulta algo muy divertido y me encanta que veas un poco mi viaje, que veas cómo he creado mi voz, cómo la estoy creando, que me acompañes en el viaje y que descubras lo muchísimo que puede cambiarte la vida. Vamos a esta conversación con Kayla Belush.
Listen to the first podcast episode with Anna, we could talk for hours. So we have a lot of very interesting things to unpack today. And as she said, we've sort of had the opposite experience in each of our respective native languages, learning different aspects of public speaking, pronunciation, intonation. There's a lot that we can unpack. So I'm very excited to do that today. I'm a speech and communication coach. I work on a lot of different aspects holistically, talking about the way we sort of communicate or perform in language. Perform is a word that we might use a few times today, unpacking some examples that Anna and I have to show you that you can learn from. And I work a lot with accent, fluency, pronunciation, and public speaking training. I find where all of those intersect so that entrepreneurs working as non-native English speakers in business or professional areas can feel much more confident showing up in their voices in corporate environments or maybe entrepreneurship. I especially love working with business owners, and I've been doing it primarily online for the past over 4 years now.
Yes, and one of the things that we are going to focus a lot today, because in the other podcast that I'm going to refer again, because I find it really, we went a little bit into public speaking, and we're going to touch that a little. But today, let's focus a lot on pronunciation. So the first thing I'm very curious about is your own journey on mastering Spanish sounds, because it seems that maybe, the first thing I think is we have 5 vowels in Spanish. There are 17 in English, and for Spanish native speakers, mastering the 17 of American English is like crazy. But maybe we have this assumption that maybe that is easier for you, like Americans, to master Spanish because it's less vowels. But maybe that's not the case. So I would love to know how you find your confidence in your Spanish voice and mastering the sounds of Spanish with the ones of American English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so for me, I have a very close relationship to that journey of learning pronunciation and changing my pronunciation in Spanish as a second language, I learned completely as an adult, for those of you who don't know my background. So I didn't have my first Spanish class until I was 16. I had always wanted to learn and be exposed to language, but I had essentially zero exposure until that first day in Spanish class. And then I didn't actually reach a basic conversational level until I was 19. And when I say basic conversational, I mean very basic. So I had all of this process more of already as an adult. And for me, learning to feel confident in my pronunciation was the biggest thing that helped me with fluency and with public speaking, and with creating really genuine relationships with other people in Spanish as a non-native language, because I felt so insecure, not only in wondering if people were going to understand me or not in terms of pronunciation. I would sort of say something and end everything as if there were a question at the end, because I was looking for validation from other people that I was clear. And I actually sounded more unclear because I was asking everything like a question because of my own lack of confidence. And then I also felt very uncomfortable with how the words felt in my mouth. It was like, you know, when you have gravel or stones in your mouth and you feel like nothing just comes out the way you want it to, you don't feel comfortable. I felt that way. And I thought that I was just supposed to be a victim to that circumstance for a while, that that's just the way it is, because that's what they teach us. Basically, that after, you know, learning something as an adult, you're just inevitably going to have this sort of accent, and that's just going to be part of who you are. And when I found out that I could work on pronunciation in college in a phonetics class, I was blown away by the fact that I could control certain sounds of Spanish that I never knew I could. So when I saw this distinction between different vowels, which seems so obvious to a Spanish speaker, that, okay, you have these vowels, you read them, how you write them, and you pronounce them exactly the same. Like it just seems so obvious. For me, that was not obvious. We use in English, our most common vowel sound in American English is called the schwa. So it's a reduced, relaxed sound. It sounds very lazy. Basically as if you were not pronouncing any vowel sound to a Spanish speaker. It's probably more of a better way to describe it. And so for me, it felt very difficult, especially with a lot of cognates that do exist between English and Spanish, words that are quite similar. It felt very difficult to implement those tense vowels. And I remember the first summer that I actively tried to do that, and I felt really confident doing it. My mouth got so tired. I remember being like exhausted after 10, 15 minutes of consciously speaking, because I would tense everything so much. And I wasn't used to that. I wanted to schwa everything because it felt a lot more comfortable.
I want to make a little pause there, because you mentioned cognates. I don't know if people that are listening to us know what that is. So what are cognates and how that relates to what you were explaining?
I'll give you guys an example of a word that seems so simple, but that felt tricky for me. I remember once I was living in Spain, sort of at the beginning stages, and I already knew a lot about pronunciation, the theory, but that doesn't mean that it was easy to implement all the time in spoken speech. So when I would go and I would order something at a restaurant, anytime there were words on the menu that were very similar to English, it was very hard for me to order those things and not say it with a super American accent. It felt really difficult. So even ordering something like a hamburguesa, una hamburguesa and hamburger, you know, they're pretty similar in the way you write them. Yes. And for me, so I would see the word hamburguesa and I would think hamburger. And so it become like hamburguesa, and I would eliminate some different sounds, trying really hard, but it was difficult to perceive it differently because the words are cognates. They're very close to each other and they do have the same meaning.
Yeah, I think it's the same that happens to us in reverse. So it's very funny, because for us, it's the opposite. Instead of tensing, we relax. So for me, it was tensing the vowels instead of relaxing them, because I find that most American English, well, English vowels are relaxed. And this is something that is what you say about having a phonetic class. Like for me, for example, and I went to translation studies. I've never had, like, maybe one day they mentioned phonetics, like, at all, you know, in my whole journey, creating my American English voice. It was something that it was my own researching, discovery, and finding, oh, but this is so important. You need to understand the basic foundation of a language is their sounds, and it's very musical, and all the intonation, everything. And the fact that American English, all these vowels, and for me, it was like not recognizing the sound, like I was basically making the Spanish sound that was similar to that sound, that vowel sound in English, and it was not at all the same sound, you know. But for me, the first thing was having the awareness that there was a sound that is different, and I have to produce it differently. Nobody taught me that, so I was basically speaking English with the Spanish system and thinking that is okay. And then, like everybody, maybe you're not as clear and you don't understand why, because nobody tells you. So that moment of realization that happened for you in the phonetic class happened for me too, but I think later, and it's like your brain explodes because you think that, oh, but I thought I was bad at this, that I could not create my voice in my own terms the way I wanted, when actually it's much more like performance, acting, and like creating something from pieces. Like, I want to know a little bit more on your process of how you created your Spanish voice. Because for me, for example, and it's something that I use training my clients, it's very useful to come from my foundational sounds of Spanish to create the new ones and understand the muscles of my mouth, how I have to move them, how the sound what is really the sound. So I want to know, in your case, how you discover that for yourself, and what were the things that helped you the most?
First, I want to tell everyone that I'll speak to that point first from an aspect of clarity, because there's so many ranges of goals that people can have for themselves in terms of pronunciation and accent. It's something most people never work on because, number one, they don't know that it exists. That's something else we can talk about.
Totally.
Most people don't know it exists. And then if they do know it exists, maybe they misperceive what the goal of it is. So the goal of when you're working on your accent or pronunciation is whatever you make it to be. And that will evolve over time, perhaps, as you reach different levels of mastery, going deeper into the layers of possibilities. For me, at the beginning, the most important thing was just to feel and sound clear. And I became like so confident. I was so confident in my voice. And then I think about the way my voice was 7 years ago when I became radically more confident, and it was not at all the same as what my voice is now. I had a mixture of different accents between like Spanish and Latino accents because of my mixed exposure to different things. The same with like vocabulary or grammatical structures. I was sort of confused sometimes, but I felt really confident in my voice because I knew that the sounds were coming out in a neutral, relatively clear way. And the first time, or the first word that I remember that I was very frustrated by when someone couldn't understand me, was my first summer that I was au pairing, taking care of some kids. Nannying is what au pairing is, if someone hasn't heard the term. And so I was with the kids and we went into the garage and they wanted to ride the bikes. And there was, one of the tires was flat. And so I had no idea how to say the tire was flat or whatever. I was just like looking for whatever word I could say. And I was like, no, the wheel needs air. And saying the word air is so similar. It's a cognate between Spanish and English. And I kept saying aire, aire, aire. And this child couldn't understand me. And then as soon as he figured out what I was saying, Aire, he corrected me a million times and tried to get me to say it. And I remember being so furious, like my blood boiled at this 7-year-old child who is like a brother to me. Like he's like family. He's coming to my wedding in a couple of months. And he made me so furious because I was like, why can't I say this? And why does it not feel comfortable? And why isn't it obvious that I should say it a different way? So for me, the biggest thing was understanding where my blocks were, like the first sounds that were the biggest struggle for me. So my first step I took in that became relying a lot on reading, which you can do in English as well. I would recommend making some adjustments depending on the sounds that you're working on in English, because English is not, you read what you
exactly.
You read it. It's a little different.
Read it, as in Spanish it is, yes.
But for an English person learning Spanish, it's very helpful to be able to see the vowels and change your perception of, you know, the vowel you see is the vowel you're going to read. It's the vowel you're going to pronounce. So it's very helpful to have that visual aspect when you're practicing. And I started reading aloud every day, 10 to 15 minutes, really focusing on the way I said everything. I didn't care what I was reading or like understanding it really. I just wanted to practice the pronunciation. And it was very tiring at first, but it made a huge difference. That first 3 or 4 months that I did it, my voice drastically changed in terms of the tension I was able to create in my voice as a speaker.
Yes, I find that is so helpful. For me, it really seems like you are playing an instrument and the instrument is your voice. So it's like when you know the music notes and you're able to recognize them. So for example, in my case, I tend to tell my clients to start to also see the phonetic representation of the word. So they starting to understand the music notes of the language with the words, and the pronunciation then becomes like clear, like becomes like this thing that is part of reading the language in a different way. Because in the case of is what you say in Spanish, the things are more like you pronounce it the way they are the way you read them. But in English, it's completely different. And I find that the more you are able to recognize the sounds with the phonetics of the symbol, it's like you open your ears to this new dimension of the language. That is one of the reasons why Spanish native speakers don't understand native speakers at all. Because I think, and this is the next question I want to ask, because I really want to touch on this. Why do you think that it's not taught in academia or in more places? Like, it's only communication coaches more also, because I think in teaching it's not also taught as well. I also think that the fact that a Spanish native speaker teaches English pronunciation, maybe sometimes it's frowned upon, I'm not sure, but I think it's very useful as well. So all of these things, why do you think there is this lack of training when it's so important to find your confidence in your...
First of all, from like an academia perspective, when we talk about the traditional school system and then college, university, everything is so like stuck in this little box of exactly how you do it and the way you should do it, because they've done it like this for hundreds of years, or this is the institution, this is the way it is. And I've seen from the inside how tricky it is to fight against that and try to get them to break down those old paradigms that they've created of how one is supposed to learn something, and say, okay, we've seen that it's proven to work this way. Let's start to adapt it. Let's do something new. It requires a lot of time and effort and energy from the people that are inside. And normally there's a couple of people that are very excited to do it. But if the institution is not willing to do the work or provide the resources for you to be able to actually make that change, then everything is just easier for them to keep it as is, which is a shame. And why I've found that I've been able to make much more impact doing things on my own as an entrepreneur and not within an academy or other places. I have been lucky to have exposure when I was in other more traditional English teaching roles before going into coaching, having people that did allow me to be creative and spontaneous in going into other aspects of language that, even though I didn't know how to describe them at that time, they let me play with it and try to figure it out and try to help people in a different way. And I think the reason why most people don't try to do that is that it requires a lot of mental energy. Like you have to want it. You have to say, okay, I want to help people in a different way, and it's going to take time and effort, and I'm going to have to really think outside of the box in how to do it. Because there's not as well, like simultaneously, there are classes and degrees you can get in things like interpretation and translation. You can get a degree in phonetics, right? Or in linguistics, but there's no formal training to get certified as this sort of accent coach or this sort of public speaking trainer. There's a lot of individual courses or certifications you can get from, an organization or an institution that's like separate from the world of official academia. But it's not like a recognized title of I got this from Harvard University. That's just not how it works. So there's less awareness of it. And I think it makes it harder for people to think that they can take action in saying, I can train someone on this, because it has to come from experience, since there's no official title you can get for it.
Exactly. And I think it's very correlated with the fact that many people are not aware that those things that are limiting them have a solution, and there are people that provide that solution. And for in this aspect of communication coaching, that, to me, it's a lot of psychology that we apply to what we do. There is a lot of pronunciation, because it's very important in this specific skill. And it's very much because we are understanding, because of our own journeys, of what these people need and the solutions they are looking for. And talking to these people, like the international professionals that maybe encounter this podcast and they are like finding this conversation. What do you think is, because for many that, in my case, I basically coach Spanish native speakers, many of them tell me that they have never even heard about the Schwa sound, like they have never heard about it. They also never touch on connected speech. And they, for example, struggle with understanding native speakers, no? And like they are doing all of these things, trying to improve, and they are very stuck and think that this is my fault, I'm not good at this, there's no way, they feel stupid, because maybe they lack the understanding that there is a way of training yourself and the methods you are using are not tackling that specific communication problem that you're going through. So in your own journey, have you encountered professionals that were unaware that they could work on this skill? And how did you see their lives changing because of creating their American English voices with you and the experience you have?
100%. I've seen most people that I've worked with didn't know before finding me that this sort of training exists. And it was something they were looking for but couldn't find because there's a lot more exposure given to traditional teaching methods. And they're like, well, when I want something that goes further than grammar or beyond vocabulary that talks about elements of voice and elements of confidence, how do I find that? Lots of them don't know that exists. A confession I can make is that I didn't know that it existed until I became one, essentially. I didn't know that it existed. And when I started, I also had no idea what the schwa sound was. I had become trained, or I trained myself through my classwork and coursework at university on Spanish phonetics, and I understood that really well. And I could write to you an IPA, which is the International Phonetic Alphabet, if you haven't heard of that, for the listeners. The IPA is like a very, scientific sort of way of writing things and sounds. And I could write you texts in different dialects and accents from different places in the Spanish-speaking world, without even really thinking about it. I could write everything in transcription. And then I transitioned to doing something in English because I was in Spain and people were asking for it in English in particular. So I was like, okay, let me try. And I had no idea how to explain English phonetics. Like I knew Spanish phonetics and I knew nothing about my own phonetic system as a native speaker. So when I learned about things like the schwa and the stress system of English and started comparing everything, I realized there were so many things that made sense about why it was difficult for me to pronounce certain Spanish sounds and why it was hard for me to understand certain things from a listening perspective, because I had like the two that I could compare, which I think is one of the benefits for someone like you, for example, who is a Spanish speaker, helping people with English, but as a native, you can compare both phonetic systems, and that's really important.
Yeah, I find what I really think now is that the best pronunciation trainers are bilingual, and I'm sorry for pronunciation trainers that are not, but if you are training somebody that is a Spanish native speaker and you have the Spanish system and you understand the Spanish vowels, because of neuroplasticity, it's easier to break it down in little pieces so that the person can understand with your vowels, because it's like the advantage of being adults that we have our mother tongue already. So that's when you set in our advantage, because for your brain, it's easier to breaking it down in little pieces than if you tell me, okay, the schwa sound is and it's like, okay, I'm doing the I remember having that, but with French, like people explaining me a French vowel and like repeating it to me, and I was not getting it, like I'm trying to imitate and I'm making the same sound. It seemed to me like I was making the same sound, but I was not, because there is an aspect of the listening that your brain is not getting it, and when they're breaking it down and they explain you how to produce it with your mouth, I think it gets clearer and it helps you to like start to open your ears to those sounds. Because for me the first thing was the awareness, like this sound is different. Like the first thing, and I'm telling you, when I was in translation, actually, like I was actually making this degree to become a professional interpreter or something, and I had no idea of phonetics and I was not pronouncing things clearly, so I was very unaware of all of that. So yeah, I find that having yourself as a trainer, the understanding of the phonetics of the language of the client that comes, from Spanish to English or English to Spanish really helps from the perspective of the way our brain
like it's learning new things. So the understanding also of the language as music, to me, it's everything, because to me, it really is not about the vocabulary. The vocabulary and the acquisition of lexicon is there, but you should start with the sounds, and from the sounds, you can create everything else. But if you don't even know the original, like each of the sounds of the language, how you can create the language. So
yeah. And definitely you can do that when you don't speak someone else's language. Like I help a lot of people that are Israeli speakers or Russian speakers, Ukrainian speakers, French speakers. So I work with people from all over the world, but you have to have some sort of idea of which consonant and vowel sounds or aspects of speech are shared among those different languages, because that will help you anticipate where it's coming from and explain it and find where that intersect is between things. So you can still help people, but you have to inform yourself a little bit on what those are, listen to other accents, expose yourself. Exactly. And actually, I'm just remembering now an example of, like 2 weeks ago, I was listening to a podcast from, it was a Spanish podcast, and from people here from Spain. And there was this guy who, I forget his name, but he works with a lot of luxury brands in the world of entrepreneurship and business. And he had this really long interview with these two young guys that have a podcast, and he kept using all of these terms in English to describe different aspects of like Spanish, business he was doing or things like that, but using very anglicized terms that come from, stuff he's been exposed to and reading and conferences, etc. And I thought about it and I was like, wow, this is another thing that's really hard for a native speaker of English to understand, is when there's a lot of, in Spanish, in my case, terminology that is borrowed from English and used in Spanish, but it has to be said with Spanish phonology and phonetics so that it makes sense to the listeners, but we're not expecting to hear that. So that word completely goes like unperceived, or we can't figure out what it is. And so he was using a ton of them. And I was like, if I didn't know why he was changing his pronunciation of every word and the way he was doing it, this would be really hard for me to understand a bunch of his words. And there was one word in particular, lipstick was the word he was using. He was saying the lipstick effect or something that exists in the world of luxury marketing. And he kept saying lipstick, 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 and dropping the final consonants, which is a big thing that Spanish speakers often do speaking English. And the biggest thing is that a P and a K sound, both of those are both aspirated in English. So an English speaker would say lipstick, and they would puff out some air with both the P and the K. And when those sounds were not only not aspirated, but felt like they disappeared, I was like, what? And that word took me a couple times. He said it a couple times. And even the podcast, the people who were interviewing him on the podcast also were like, the what? And they're like, pinta labios. But for that word, I don't think it was necessary for him to say lipstick. He could have said another word. But that's another struggle that native English speakers have when they're listening to Spanish.
Yes, it's like understanding also why the Spanish speakers is struggling so much. It's because okay, for Spanish native speakers, this normally happens because of that aspect of I don't have this consonant or this vowel, so it's challenging for me to pronounce it. So it really helps also to understand what are the things that we normally struggle the most, like the ed endings, that we struggle a lot with the ed endings and all of those things. I was going to ask you actually about that too. Like, what do you think are the aspects on pronunciation that we Spanish native speakers struggle the most and we should focus so that we are clear for native speakers?
Based on the example I just gave,
that's a great one.
One of the biggest things, that's a good segue, is the consonant sounds at the end of words, like fully pronounce them. And if it's especially like an aspirated sound, like a K or a P or a T, push out that sound with a little bit more emphasis. It'll probably feel like you're saying it wrong the first time you say it. If you're not used to saying it like that, you'll feel like you're making a mistake, which is where you sort of feel like you're acting or putting on some sort of different persona at first to be able to say it, but it genuinely doesn't sound clear to an English speaker if you don't fully push out that last sound. So consonant sounds are really big. I mean, vowels are very important, but consonants are huge, especially at the end of words. So a word like Actually, I hear this a lot in the word.
The word truth, it comes to me like when you were saying that, the word truth, because I coach a lot of my clients with that one, you know, like it's the consonants in the beginning and the end of truth. It's really challenging for many of us to pronounce it, you know, because exactly of that. The consonants you have to pronounce strong in the beginning and in the end. In truth.
And it's even harder in truth because you have the transition into an R and then an R into an U, which is a more difficult transition as well, plus a TH. So like the R into U into TH is one of the hardest transitions.
Yeah, exactly.
So the word truth is terrible for people.
It's terrible. It's a terrible one.
Yeah. So truth is a great example. The name Frank, or if you say the word like Frank, like frankly speaking, something like that, people always drop the K and they say Fran, you know, as a name, but you would hear an English speaker say Frank. A word like worked, I use worked as an example because it's not only an ED ending, but an ED ending that has a K plus a T pronunciation at the end. So both of those are aspirated. We puff out air, worked.
And the vowel sound is very challenging too, because we tend to reduce it to an O. So we normally pronounce work it or work. Yeah, it's the ED ending, the vowel sound work is crazy. And also it's very easy to mix up with walk, you know, caminar, walk and work. Very easy to confuse these two. So yes, there are many.
Totally.
I have, for example, in my case, the anecdote I always remember that happened to me regarding the sounds of English that I was totally unaware that I was pronouncing with Spanish sounds was ques and quis, like la I larga y la I corta. So for me, it was an anecdote of mixing up both. And I was actually giving a kiss to someone because I thought that they were asking me to give him a kiss, but they were asking me for the keys, like if I wanted the keys in the house, because it was...
That would also be so uncomfortable because you're like, I don't understand why you're asking this of me right now.
Exactly. It was really confusing for me. Like, why do you want that I give you a kiss? And yeah, for me, that was one of the first realizations of, I thought that my English was okay because my grades were good, you know, this kind of thing of, oh, I'm good at this because my grades are okay. And, you know, I should not have any problem. But then in real life, living with, this was an exchange family in the UK, was my first experience abroad in the UK. I loved it. It was, I loved these experiences, are the best. And that was the first day entering the house. And I was like, okay, they don't understand me.
I know nothing. What am I doing with my life?
What I've been
None of this
doing.
is worth anything.
What I've been doing, I've been losing all of this time and all my, so that was kind of the first realization, but I was totally unaware because I still didn't know about phonetics or about pronunciation training. I think this conversation will have been amazing for the 12-year-old, you know, that I was back then, because I didn't realize that I was basically speaking English with the Spanish vowels, you know?
Yeah. And even for the vowels, like for those who are listening that feel maybe very intimidated by those really subtle vowel differences that feel obvious to a native speaker, but that don't feel obvious if you haven't trained your ear to pay attention to them as a Spanish speaker. It's not only about the vowels, like you can focus on other things that are easier at first, like the example that you said, Anna, with a sound like truth, or how, you know, having a TH at the end of a word, or a K at the end of a word, or typical vowels or consonants that normally get confused or not fully pronounced in Spanish, but that you will hear English speakers pronounce them very differently. You can think of like a typical accent, like American or English accent that you would hear someone say something with in Spanish, and try to feel like, what are they doing differently in their mouths? A sound that most people would never talk about. Like I don't see people really advertise this as like one of the main sounds that an American should work on to, you know, help their Spanish accent. But like T versus D sounds, T's and D's, like in a word in Spanish, if I say it with a very American accent, dedo, finger, for those who don't know Spanish, dedo, dedo versus dedo, no tiene nada que ver, totally different. V's versus B's, you know, I would pronounce every V like V. I would touch my teeth to my lip, and I'd say nada que ver would be nada que ver. not a K bear. And if you feel what it would be like when someone, you know, puts a lot of accent on a word and you try to identify in your mouth where that's coming from and play with it, you will find that, okay, there are certain sounds that are maybe easier for me to find. Like I see a V, I'll pronounce a V. It's a little bit easier to work on than a vowel at first. You can start with that as well. It doesn't have to be with a vowel if that feels a little bit too intimidating at the beginning, or if you don't have someone to coach you through and you feel a little confused, you can start with something a little bit more simple.
Yeah, and start building your confidence, and also the joy of training yourself on pronunciation. I find it really fun, but I think the approach that is very like on phonetics and pronunciation is when you start to see it as music and start to see it as a performance and playing with your voice and experimenting. And I think for many people, listening to their own voices in that recording, it's a very hard thing to do. But I find that our voices are our ultimate expression of who we are. It's our essence. And going into that, I want to ask you about your journey for me, it's kind of traveling with our voices when we are creating our voices in a different language. So I want to ask you about how this changed you as a person, how these open aspects of yourself that it was because of creating this Spanish voice. By the way, Kayla is going to marry very soon somebody that is from Spain. So it has totally an impact in your personal life. But I want to a little bit understand, and the people listening to us, how, because I really believe creating your voice change your life, creating a new voice change your life and change you as a person. So I would like you to tell us a little bit about your own journey, because for me, it was very life-changing experience. So how it was for you with Spanish.
It allowed me to completely deconstruct and reconstruct my personality at the same time, especially doing it as an adult. I think we have the advantage of you're conscious of how you speak, how it's representing who you are as a person and your personality. Like you can sort of go a step further, you can dive deeper into it in a way that when you're very young as a child, you just don't have the self-awareness or consciousness yet to go that deep. Maybe you're understanding things on a subconscious level, but you can't bring that to the forefront of your mind and think, oh, the way I'm speaking and the way it's representing me and myself and my personality, that's a little bit out of reach when you're, you know, like 6 years old. So I think we have that benefit as adult learners to be able to do that. And for me, the shift focused at some point from the actual language I was speaking to the experience I was living in that language and the emotional connection. And that came from being able to be confident enough to not worry about all of the little things that, you know, I would worry about on a speaking exam or something like that. You know, when you start to actually have real moments of emotional connection with other people in another language, and you can feel confident in that moment because you feel confident in your voice and who you are and the way you show up, you see that your focus is able to change. And I was able to advocate for myself in moments when maybe people didn't treat me right, or I wasn't receiving the respect that I deserved. I was able to stand up for myself, which was always, and is still at times, something that's hard for me to do in English.
Yeah.
So I actually learned, I feel confident saying I learned to speak up for myself in Spanish before I learned to speak up for myself in English. And that's a huge thing that Spanish gave me. And I'm really proud of myself for that. Yeah, and it's affected everything in terms of personal life, you know, with the friends that I have, my relationship with my partner, family that I've made for myself, my au pair family from, okay, so I just turned 28. So I was 19 the first time I went. So 9 years ago when I met them, I would have never thought that, you know, 9 years later, that family would be coming to my wedding that I was going to celebrate in Spain with someone from here. Like that just would have been a totally unrealistic thought for me, but language gave me access to other relationships and other family members and other friends. And I started my business because I'm living here. I honestly don't think I would have ever become an entrepreneur if I was living in the US, because job opportunities would have been different and I would have sought out a very typical career path. So everything about my life is sincerely due to the fact that I decided to speak another language and go deeper on who I am as a person and how I wanted to perceive myself and how I wanted others to perceive me in that like performance of life, you know, who am I?
Exactly. I really like that aspect that you just said about choosing and the performance, because I really think that it begins maybe as a performance and it becomes real when you apply it into your relationships and the emotional connection. I think is so important. But it is a performance and it is very fun. Like if you start to approach it like that, to play with yourself from that place, because then everything is possible. Because many times, maybe things that you wouldn't do as a Spanish speaker, you find that distance in English that allows you to try things and see yourself in a different way. But it is the same thing as when you travel and you go like somewhere that is very far away from your own hometown or whatever, and you start to do things that you will never do at your hometown, because here I can experiment, here I can be
Yeah, you have the permission to, because you're like, that's just normal here. So if you start to speak a different way, you're like, oh, well, that's just normal. People will understand me because that's how it should sound. And then, yeah, you feel a lot more confident.
Yes, I think that it kind of opens, for me at least, a door of my self-expression to be very creative. I also find that, for example, I love English because of the music. I always loved, I remember listening to music, lyrics in English, and I was in love with the human voice, the way it's produced in English. Even more than in Spanish, I'm sorry, it's true. I don't know if there is something in the sound, in the vibration of the voice, of the human voice in this language, that is so beautiful and musical that I'm in love with it. And my ears are like, I want more, and it's just an attraction that I have to it from the sound and the human voice. I think it's such a beautiful sound. And in English is really melodic and really beautiful. So coming a little bit now into like one of my final questions and thinking about identity and performance, let's choose one public speaker from America that you find very interesting or that will be inspiring to talk about this person, so that the people listening to us can start having more references of public speakers or this kind of work with the voice and aspects of the voice that you would like for us to talk about.
Yeah, so someone I've looked into a lot more over the past months as a performer, as a speaker, as an artist is Ariana Grande. And I think she's a great example for this because she's very big in pop culture. Most people will have heard a song from Ariana Grande. If you don't know who she is, look up her top hits and you'll be like, oh, I heard that song on the radio. Like it'll be obvious to you. But she is someone who is incredible as a singer. She is hands down, one of the most talented voices I've ever heard. So I love to watch the way she performs. And most of the time, all I've done is watch, clips of her performing, but not as much of her speaking. And the last couple of months, there's a lot that's coming out about her participation in Wicked, which they're making into a movie as well. So, because I think, was it Wicked? Oh no, I'm thinking of another Broadway play. I was thinking of Phantom of the Opera. Scratch that. But yeah, so Wicked is still on Broadway. But so Ariana Grande has this, dream from years ago to do anything that has to do with Wicked. It's like her favorite musical and she's obsessed with it. And you can see in her spoken expression how the way that she had to train for a certain role for singing and for acting and for performing changed the way she represented herself as a speaker as well. So like everything affects us. And I think people can see a very different phase of Ariana Grande right now if you watch an interview with her now and you see.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I have never wanted something as badly as I did this. And I tried to use that to take lessons every single day while I was doing the voice and get ready for these auditions. I trained every day with Nancy and with Eric to transform my voice, even like my singing voice, everything about me. I had to kind of deconstruct to prove to them that I could handle taking on this other person. I kind of had to completely erase pop star Ari, the person that they know so well, because like it's even harder to believe someone as someone else when you're so branded as one thing. So I kind of had to really go all the way to strip that down and come into my callback with no makeup, my hair down, like I looked 11 years old. It was like, but I really, really worked hard for it. And my God, I'm so grateful for it because it is the best most transformative and special experience of my life. And the funniest thing is like the reason why I thought I loved Glinda since I was 10 years old is so not what makes us so adjacent to one another. Like, it's so, the high notes and the comedy and the pink and the laughs and being, the clown is like what I was attracted to when I was 10, but it's so interesting that there's a lot more to it underneath the surface.
See her voice and the way she uses it and the feeling that her voice has. It's like light, it's airy, it's pure, it has a different sort of tone and melody to it versus when she was really hard in her pop star era. And the words she chose to use, the way she chose to express herself, her mannerisms, even like if you look at her body language, everything is totally different. It's like a completely different person. So the way that she chose to perform has had a direct correlation on how she shows up as a person and in her relationships. And that's okay for those things to change us when it's serving us. She has all of these lessons that she's learned from it and that she's taken out of it and realized that she's going to go through stages and she's going to evolve. And I think that's a great lesson for us to learn as public speakers, as entrepreneurs, as non-native speakers in another language. We're going to go through those phases as well.
Yeah, and you basically, the voice is like the first impression that voice and body language is kind of the first impression and the way that it comes through. And Ariana Grande, I think now in the interview, she says that she's turning 30, like I think you're similar ages, right?
And I'm 28. Yep, I just turned 28.
I think that she said that she's turning into 30s now. So yeah, that aspect of maturity coming from that pop era as an artist and how she's evolving and how that is going to transform her performances or the things that she is choosing to do and the way she's choosing to use her voice, into kind of like a very different, maybe Ariana Grande that we're going to have in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I think that she's an incredible performance. I listen to some of her music. I'm not an expert on her, but I listen to some of her songs, and she has the voice that goes through ranges that is unbelievable. Like when she go with the voice, because for example, for me with English, in Spanish you don't have to like go take your voice, project your voice in many different ways. It's basically I, O, like the vowels are simple, like tense. With English, you have to modulate the voice, project the voice from different places. And I like it a lot, from the perspective of singing and the way you are using your voice in different ways that we are not using our voice in that way in Spanish. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is that aspect that is similar to what singers do. But Ariana Grande, it's crazy what this woman does with her voice. It's unbelievable,
Yeah, and I keep getting more interested in learning more about her background and who she is and where she came from and how she got to where she's gotten to. There's so much that's out there about celebrities or public speakers that people sort of feel like they know them, but how are you going to know anything about someone that, has been here for 30 years working on these goals? There's so much knowledge and like a wealth of experience that she's had and so much we could learn from that. And something that I found really interesting is in this contrast interview of her, talking about when Wicked was her dream role and she would do anything to audition for it. You see someone who's accomplished all of these things and has a voice that most would, kill for. They would do anything to be in her shoes. And she's like, I will do anything. I will go and get you coffee every day. And I will sit outside your door and just be there for hours and just wait for you to give me an opportunity and give me a chance. And that sort of hunger for more to reach another level of her professional expansion of where she could go and where she could take things. That hunger is something that you have from the start. That if you have that hunger to be that sort of public speaker, to be that sort of singer, to be that sort of speaker of a language as a non-native speaker, that hunger is going to take you through till the very end. It's never going to go away. There's always going to be something else that you want to accomplish. But seeing that someone who has accomplished everything still feels like that and feels like, who am I to have this role? And I felt so unworthy. And at the same time, I knew I would do whatever I could to make it happen. And this is my only like big dream right now. And I'll do anything to get there, and I'll work my tail off to make it happen. That's the same feeling we all go through when we have any sort of goal. And she felt the same as any of us feel when we're just trying to nail that next sound, or feel like we can really hit the right pitch or melody when we're speaking to someone in a sales conversation, or when we're, you know, interviewing for an English speaking job or something like that. There's so many intersects we can see. And I think she's a real role model in what she's been able to accomplish with her voice, and how she's adapted and molded to different situations in her career.
Yeah, I love that. You know, I think we need to have, I always say, like a library of public speakers that inspire us and that we look up to, even more when American English is your second language. And it's like you need references and you need to look up to speakers that you like and that inspire aspects that you want to bring for yourself, that you need to see them somewhere in other people. And I find that those aspects of confidence is so important, and people that exude that confidence as public speakers so important. And the aspect of worthiness, you can always work on that. So you can always, regardless of where you are in life, you know, if you're in business, entrepreneurship, if you work for something else, like it doesn't matter. You can always come back to the element of confidence, can be there and can not. And I think Ariana Grande is a great example, because you may think, why will she not be confident with everything she has already accomplished about her ability and skill? So we can all be humble with that, you know, like it's okay to be insecure about things, and it's part of life and it's part of our journeys. Because these people that you may think they are in these pedestals, they are human, and as humans we all have insecurities, fears. And I think the beautiful thing is having goals and trying to go for dreams or the things that we actually like and inspire us or excite us. And yeah, that's a great inspiration. It's a public speaker. Yes.
Yeah. And I think for anyone else that has a goal that right now feels like this goal felt for Ariana Grande playing in Wicked, for her it was such a huge goal. It was like, if that would be, you know, my life dream achieved, she'll have another life dream that comes up after that, because we all do. That's our natural human nature. But you know, when you have one of those goals that feels so big, it's so exciting. It scares the shit out of you, because you're like, will I ever be able to do that? And there's going to be so many people that tell you can't. Like, how many people probably told Ariana Grande that, look, you're a pop star, you're a pop singer, like you have this kind of voice. Yes, you've had background in other things, you're very versatile, whatever, but maybe, you know, we're looking for someone with this public image, or we're looking for, you know, you don't fit into what we're looking for. And how many times do we feel that as non-native speakers
A lot of
in
times.
another language, that we can't be that person, or we can't show that aspect of confidence? And for me, I have very specific moments where I think of like certain actors or actresses that I have seen on, you know, Spanish television or Netflix, that exude a sort of confidence or behavior or personality that I'm like, wow, that's a confidence that I've never naturally had. And it's like an element or a kind of attitude that you don't really see in the US. Like, there's certain attitude differences that I notice all the time between Spanish people and Americans. And I think sometimes of those actresses that I've used as like examples, and I'm like, you know, how would she say this if she had to respond to someone treating her like that? Like, what sort of tone of voice would she use? And I put myself in the role of badass Tokyo from Casa de Papel or something like that. And I'm like, you know, what would she say? Because sometimes you have to bring out a different aspect of your personality.
Ursula Corbero, it's really confident. Like, you listen to her in interviews or things like that, and she has a huge charisma and confidence about herself. But yeah,
Big
I
voice.
find the same thing happens with Americans. You know, like I so many times, for example, Jessica Chastain, or I don't know, actresses that I really admire what they do, and they, you know, American women for me feel really confident and independent. So it's very curious that you have that aspect of Spanish women as well, you know. I like it.
I think we're independent or outspoken in different ways, like socially, culturally, there's different areas, and they're so subtle. This is something that I think from a sociological perspective, you know, we could do a whole study and, you know, break down all of the differences, but there are these like micro things that you would never pick up on or never want to pay attention to until you understand language or communication on a deeper level. You're looking for it, you're searching, you know, where is that other layer? Because there's so many different subtle aspects that play into how we show up as a person, and that performance of, you know, who we are, not for just for other people, but for ourselves. You know, I want to feel really proud of who I am and who I show up as for myself more than for other people. I think when people think of the word performance, they think of how I'm performing for others, because that's the traditional sense of the word. But I think of it more as for how am I showing up for myself? Am I doing myself justice in terms of what my dream is and where I want to go? And am I doing everything I can to get there, regardless of all the people that are going to tell me I can't, the people that are going to say rude comments, the people that are going to make a comment about accent or where are you from, or, oh, that's cute that you think you can do that. There's so many things that you're going to hear throughout your career as a professional speaking English, or also just as someone who's in love with the language and wants to use it personally. You have to figure out a way to brush that off and show up for yourself, for your own performance.
Yeah, you have to give yourself permission to perform first, always, and be your first audience. And I think many times you are the strongest audience, like the hardest critic of your own performance, you know. But yeah, it is very curious. Like when I love also the conversation on cultural differences and how that impact our behavior or the way we are and the perception that somebody from a different culture has, because many times we think it's invisible and it's not. And there are a lot of things on culture that change, and like the understanding of that helps a lot in communication too, because many times those barriers are cultural, or there are things that go unaware. You know, you are unaware of the aspects around politeness or the way you say something or the tone, or there are so many things. That's why this is such a great skill to train people or to bring awareness into how we communicate, and even more in an intercultural setting when you are dealing with people from different cultures. And in the case of Americans, that there is so much we need to learn, because it's not only Hollywood and the movies. I think many times we think, oh, but I know about America because I watch all of these American movies, and you know, but we have no idea. So I'm gonna ask you about that actually before we finish. What are the main misconceptions we have about Americans, Spanish people? Because you're an expert on that, and that you think you should know this about American culture, American people, beyond what is maybe the mainstream characterization that we have about it?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I've experienced as an American living in Spain, people ask, oh, well, what part of the US are you from? And I always say upstate New York, which no one knows what upstate means, but for me, it feels good to say upstate New York, or I say from the state of New York, to differentiate myself from New York City, because the cultures that come from different cities or different areas of the US, yes, there is an overall like American culture that can connect Americans in general, but the kind of personality and experiences someone has had from living in New York City their whole life are so different from someone who's lived in the rural USA. And I've always lived in small towns. I've lived in 3 different states in the US throughout my life. When I was youngest in Ohio, and then later in the South in North Carolina. And then when I was 16, moved to New York, which is where all of my family is from originally. So culturally, I also relate much more to how people are culturally in upstate New York compared to North Carolina, for example, because that's where my family and my roots are from. So, well, at least this generation, right? We talk about roots. There's a whole other conversation where Americans come from,
yes.
immigration-wise. But for me, it's very important to show people that New York City or Los Angeles, Hollywood aren't the only experiences of Americans, just like, you know, the typical things that we see promoted from Spain, like Sevilla and paella and las ferias, los toros. all of that is not the only thing that makes me, because there's so much diversity between not only linguistically and accent wise, but you know, the food, the culture, the personality people have, depending on the kind, like the place they're from, regionally speaking. There's so much that goes into that, and that's the same in the US. So that's the biggest thing I like people to learn when they ask me things. Then there are some things that let's say are a little bit exaggerated sometimes in the movies, like, you know, typical when people watch movies like Mean Girls, or, you know, and they see how high school culture is in the US, like, yes, there's always some element of things like that that do happen, but most of them are exaggerations of what life is like, and that's why it's entertaining, because there's a bit of truth in it, which people can relate to the truth, but everything is taken to an extreme that makes it way more funny or way more sad or way more relatable or something, you know. So if we dulled down those stories, it wouldn't be fun for Hollywood, and no one would buy them and no one would watch them. It wouldn't be interesting. So everything is an exaggeration most of the time. So you can't, you know, take it for exactly what you see, but there are underlying aspects of truth behind those levels of culture that you see in Hollywood.
Yeah, definitely. It's like a mixture of everything. For example, now I've been listening to the last album of Beyonce that I'm a huge fan. And she now makes this album on country music, and I was kind of researching a little bit about it. And it's because she had a background on rhythm and blues and like funky and pop and rock even, but she was not welcomed by the country music genre in a way. And she was, you know, I'm Beyonce, I'm going to experiment on this.
Beyonce, I'll do whatever the hell I want. Like, tell me now.
Yes. For example, for me with American culture, I'm hugely connected with Afro-American culture. Like for me, it's an attraction I have that is beyond charts, you know. The music, there's so much things about this Afro-American culture that I feel attracted to, their energy. And to me, America is this melting pot of all of these things. And for example, Texas or Austin, or, you know, I was curious to learn about this state, for example, because of what you say, besides New York and LA, Hollywood, you don't get
Texas, it's its whole own thing. Yeah. Exactly. Louisiana, Alaska,
exactly. Yes, Alaska, yes, exactly. And all of the accents and all of that. But for me, for example, it's something that I really love. When you watch an original version of a movie and you're able to, the color of the accent of each place, like when you were saying about South Carolina, I remember watching movies that were set in South Carolina, and it was so beautiful. Like, I want to go there, you know, like, and the sound is very, like the southern states also like have this very melodic sound that is so different from, the east.
The southern draw.
Yeah. So for me, it's something that I love because it's like this kind of American English, this kind of orchestra of sounds and like the speakers of all of these different places and their stories. So yeah, it's great to be able to speak with someone from there that can tell us more into it in a way that is more realistic rather than the movies that maybe are, as you say, not as true. Using the word again, truth to pronounce. Okay, so thanks a lot, Kayla, because I could be talking hours and hours, but I want to be like knowledgeable about your time. So if you want to tell also our audience about your services, where they can find you, where they can find what you do and your work, because I think that everybody listening would love to get to contact you or get to know where you are.
I provide speech and communication coaching, especially tailored for people who are non-native English speakers, working as entrepreneurs, business owners, or working as professionals in English. So what my work does is really find that intersects between everything that we've talked about so far, talking about identity, fluency, accent, pronunciation. A lot of my clients do really love the accent pronunciation part a lot, and they are very heavy on that. Preparing things like presentations, social media content that they're going to put out there, preparing for interviews or maybe conferences that they have to give, and they want to feel very confident on that. So I think I attract a lot of people that love the accent part because I'm so passionate about it and I talk about it all the time. So I think I attract that a lot. And my signature course that I made for this a few years back Enhanced English for Entrepreneurship is something that I take most of my clients through. They get access to all of that when they sign up for one-on-one coaching with me. And that goes through layers of how all of these things come together in fluency, public speaking, and accent and use of voice in general. Just recently, I actually launched that course so that it can be self-paced as well. So someone can now have access to buying that course without actually getting the one-on-one mentorship from me. So if you want something that's more at your own pace, or you're a little bit nervous, maybe you've never had a coach before and that feels a little intimidating for you, there are also other ways to access that now. Another service I provide is one-on-one accent consultation. So maybe you just want to have an idea of how do I sound, or how close am I to this specific goal that I want to reach? And you want to get an action plan of the top 5 things that you should be implementing into your practice and get those materials so that you can start working on your goal as sort of a jump start with just a one-off session. All of that can be found on my website. I have a new website now. I'm going through a phase of rebranding, which I'm very excited about. So it's ambientiumspeechcoaching.com. I'll share the link with you, Anna, so that people can see that there if they want. I'm also now offering workshops for, let's say, a corporation or a business, someone that wants a workshop or a presentation for their employees. That's also another service that I'm offering now. And if anyone wants to connect with me, you can also find me on Instagram, LinkedIn, or YouTube at just my name, at Kayla Belush, and we can connect there.
Okay, I'm gonna share all of the links below in the description of the podcast, and in YouTube also in the description, so that everybody can reach you out and find your beautiful services that are very, as you say, holistic, right? That I like to use the word integral, but it's like this idea of touching all the dimensions of the person, the psychology, the mindset, that goes beyond everything communication. So you're exploring yourself in a different way, in a integral way. I find this is such a beautiful service to have access to. So thanks a lot for what you're doing, Kayla, in the world as an entrepreneur, and your experience, everything you share. I find it's really amazing and very inspired by your work. And thanks a lot for coming and being part of our community in Inglés Americano. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was an honor, and I love that you are so outspoken as a public speaker of English, as a non-native speaker. I believe you give a lot of example to others who want to have that same sort of confidence to show up and be on a podcast, be on YouTube, show up on social media. I think you're an amazing example for everyone. So thank you for everything you do. We're like the same person reversed in different languages. So.
Totally.
That's why we like each other. We just see each other in the other person.
It's gonna happen again, for sure. So have a great rest of the day, and all of you have a great rest of the day too, and see you here for the next one. Bye.